March 26th, 2010. It was around 10:30 p.m. on a Friday evening, and a middle-aged man and his 20-year-old son were returning home. The man was Dr. Craig McAllister, an orthopedic surgeon who lived and worked in the Kirkland area of Washington, about 15 miles northeast of Seattle. His son, Ryan, had just returned from college to visit for his spring break holiday. Craig had driven down from their home, along Lake Washington, to SeaTac International Airport to pick him up. They came home directly from the airport and had to park along the street in front of the house. Earlier in the day, Dr. McAllister had arranged for a truckload of mulch to be delivered, which was sitting in a giant pile in the middle of the driveway. As they walked up to the front of the house, they were suddenly accosted by a man wearing all black. His face was covered in a ski mask. This strange man calmly told the two McAllisters that he had a gun, and that if they just cooperated, no one would get hurt. He then insisted that both Craig and Ryan go along with his demands, and lead him inside the house. Dr. Craig McAllister, though, knew that that wasn't going to happen, because out here, it was just him and his adult son. Inside, though, were his wife, Stacy, and his 13-year-old daughter, Lauren. There was no way he could let this masked stranger inside. So, Craig did what his fight-or-flight reflexes were telling him to do. He fought. He jumped onto the masked man and began raining punches down upon him. He was lashing out, trying his hardest to disorient and distract the man in a ski mask, while his son, Ryan, fled in the direction of a neighbor's house. Moments later, a second masked man emerged from the corner of the house. Dr. McAllister never saw him coming, but he felt him. The second man in a ski mask pistol-whipped Craig from behind with a .45 caliber pistol. It immediately opened up a wound behind his left ear, and achieved its intended effect. The doctor was immediately subdued. Craig was led to the front door by the two men, who began trying to kick in the front door. Craig's wife, Stacy, was drawn to the noise at the front door. It being 10:30 p.m. on a Friday, and with her son expected home any minute now, she did not think much of it, so she began to approach the front door. Quote, "As soon as I opened the door, I saw this man dressed from head to toe in black, and he was yelling at me. I immediately slammed the door, deadbolted it, and called 911. Stacy locked the deadbolt on the front door and ran towards the back to phone the police. At around the same time, her son, Ryan, had made it to a neighbor's home and was dialing 911 as well. The two masked men, who were becoming more frustrated and flustered, demanded that Dr. McAllister let them inside the home. He was now laying on the ground, a sort of hostage. In no certain terms, while laying there and nursing his head wound, he told them that he either would not or could not let them inside the house. At this point, the two bumbling home invaders realized that this whole ordeal kept getting worse and worse with every passing second. They muttered between themselves for a moment, then demanded that Craig give them his car keys. Craig was about to give in to their demands. He began reaching into his pocket when he realized that his car keys were on the same ring as his house key. So, in order to avoid them going inside his home, he told a little lie. He said that his son, Ryan, had driven them and had the car keys, and his son was now long gone. Quote, "They kind of mumbled to themselves and said, 'You stay on the ground, we're leaving.' I could see them gallop up the driveway and down the road." After seeing the two gunmen leave, Dr. Craig McAllister stood up. He made his way inside, and waited for police to arrive. By the time they got there, minutes later, both culprits had run off into the night. Sheriff's deputies responded to the potential home invasion. They brought with them both a canine team and a helicopter equipped with heat-seeking equipment. They were unable to find a trail that led them to the two masked men. The attack on this small family, along scenic Lake Washington, sparked concerns in this community. It also proposed a lot of unanswered questions, such as who the two men had been, why they wanted inside the home of Dr. Craig McAllister, and what they would have done if they had gotten inside. But at the scene, police would find one incredibly important clue: a ski mask belonging to one of the gunmen. It had been ripped off during Dr. McAllister's scuffle near his own driveway. Investigators would take this ski mask into evidence, and it would end up pointing to a decade-old case file, a murder investigation which had gone ice cold. This is the story of Mike Emmert. Welcome to Unresolved. I am your host, Micheal Whelan. If you are new to the podcast, I just want to say thank you for checking it out. This story is a pretty complicated one, even by unsolved mystery standards. Today's episode features a couple of separate stories, which may seem a bit scattered and unrelated at times, but I promise they all do sync up by the end. So if throughout the episode you find yourself thinking, why the hell is he telling me this? I promise I am going somewhere with it. If you enjoy listening to the podcast and want to hear more of it, you could start by heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod. There, you could become a patron and help financially support the show, and get access to some pretty cool perks, such as bonus episodes. The first 2 of these bonus episodes are out right now, and I'm hoping to put one out every 2 to 3 weeks. However, if you want to help support the show but don't want to put any money towards it, you could also head to iTunes or Apple Podcast to leave Unresolved a 5-star rating and a review. I know it's annoying to hear that every episode, but these reviews are so vital for independent podcasts like this one. So thank you for at least hearing me out, and thank you to those that have actually left ratings and reviews. Now, without any more chit-chat, we're going to turn back the dial to the early 2000s and learn more about the subject of today's story. Michael Angelo Emmert was actually born Michael Angelo Locati on November 13th, 1960. His parents, Angelo Locati and Sandra Emmert, divorced when he was just 6 years old. After their divorce, he began going by his mother's maiden name, Emmert, and it was then officially changed. He grew up in the area of Walla Walla, which is a county as well as a city in southeastern Washington state. He graduated from Walla Walla High School in 1979, and then began attending Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. From there, he would graduate just a few years later. For a handful of years, he owned and operated a company called Superior Seed Company while living in the Tri-Cities area of eastern Washington. Later that decade, in the 1980s, inspired by an uncle that had made it as a successful real estate agent, Mike began working in the field. In 1990, he got his real estate license, and the following year, 1991, he began working for Windermere Real Estate. At this point, Mike had moved to the western side of Washington state, and when he began working for Windermere, he began working in the highly competitive Seattle market. As a realtor, Mike Emmert was very well liked and well regarded, not only by his coworkers, but his customers as well. He had won Realtor of the Year from Windermere, as well as being named a top Puget Sound real estate professional twice, in 1998 and 1999, and even began selling multiple homes that exceeded $1 million in price. Mike was thriving in a heated market, as Seattle began exploding in the 1990s with several tech startups and a burgeoning economy. Stuart Miner, a spokesman for Windermere Real Estate, described Mike's standing in the community. Quote, Mike was highly regarded as a professional who went out of his way to help the client. His colleagues defined him as an amazing person because of his energy, sense of humor, and integrity. Mike's charming personality endeared him to a young woman named Mary Beth Chandler, who along with her mother also worked in the field of real estate. In the mid-1990s, the two began dating, and by 1996, the two were married. Those that knew Mike and Mary Beth Emmert described them as quote-unquote soulmates. They were a couple that had a strong connection from the get-go and loved one another fiercely. Mary Beth had a daughter from a prior relationship who would become Mike's stepdaughter. Mike took an active role in her upbringing, often attending sporting events with her and even serving as her basketball coach for a couple of years as she entered middle school. Mike and Mary Beth would have no additional children of their own. The small family lived in the area of Redmond, a city about 15 miles east of Seattle, but part of the same metropolitan area. For reference, Redmond is just east of Kirkland, the town from this episode's introduction, and is also north of Lake Sammamish. Redmond is also considered the home of Microsoft, in case you were wondering. It's a well-regarded, prominent area, which was indicative of the kind of success that Mike and Mary Beth Emmert were having going into the 21st century. On January 3rd, 2001, Mike Emmert met up with a client at a shopping mall not too far away from his office and home over in Kirkland. This client, who had contacted him directly, was interested in looking at homes along the market in the east side area, near Woodinville. Woodinville is a smaller city about 10 miles north of Kirkland, and even though it's not a rural area by any stretch of the imagination, it's definitely a lot more of a suburban area. There is much more green around, at the very least. Especially back in 2001, before the area really exploded in population. This client in question also had a home in particular that he wanted to look at, which they made a priority on their list. Since Mike was not managing that property, he spoke to the seller's dealer and arranged a time for them to visit that day. The home that this potential client was looking at, up in the 19500 block of 157th Place Northeast, was valued at $589,000. It was a modern, recently built, brick and beige 3-story home in an area full of older ranch-styled houses. Mike met this client at the parking lot of a nearby shopping mall, and together they headed up to the home in question. The house was located on a dead-end cul-de-sac on a private lot, sort of away from any of the neighbors. It was pretty isolated, and the home was set back from the road itself. The two men toured the home, and Mike picked up on the other man's interest. The client had picked out this home in particular, and Mike seemed hopeful that he'd be able to close the sale pretty quickly. The two left, and Mike eventually dropped off the man at the parking lot they had originally met at. Later that night, he spoke with his wife about this potential client. He described him as being quote-unquote odd, that he was estimated to be in his early 50s, that he walked with a limp and carried a cane with him, and that he spoke with some kind of East Coast accent. Mike also told his wife, Mary Beth, that the man claimed to have recently relocated from Northern California. He had said that he was currently staying with friends, and he worked either as a counselor or something a lot like it. Mike wasn't exactly sure. Mike also told his wife that, in his conversation with this other man, he had let drop that he was preparing to come into a large sum of money, perhaps from an inheritance. The way that Mike described this encounter to his wife, he seemed to be talking about a very strange client, which, as a real estate agent, they encountered almost on a daily basis. This was just kind of the day's odd story, which Mike wanted to share. However, details were scarce, and Mary Beth didn't think about pushing for many more. The following day, Thursday, January 4th, 2001, started off like any other day. Mike showered, got dressed, ate breakfast, and then went to work. His wife, Mary Beth, who also worked as a realtor at the same office, did the same. When he arrived at work early that morning, Mike told a coworker that he was going to meet up with a quote-unquote weird dude later that morning. However, he did not share many details, just dropping this tidbit as a joke, a conversation starter, something like that. He marked in a work ledger, his daily planner, that he was going to meet up with a client named Steven. From here on out, I will refer to this client as Steven, as this name became their standalone identifier. This mysterious client had made no communication with the rest of the Windermere office, having contacted Mike directly. Once again, Mike and Steven met up at the parking lot of the nearby Kirkland Park Place shopping mall. This in itself was very unusual, as potential clients usually meet with realtors and other agents at their office, or at the property that they were going to be viewing. Meeting at a third location was viewed as strange, even to Mike's wife, Mary Beth, who later stated, quote, "It was a red flag for me." Mike and Steven met up at the Kirkland Park Place parking lot at around 11:30 that morning. They then proceeded to head to the Woodinville property that they had viewed the day before, driving together in Mike's black 2000 Cadillac Escalade. At around 12:30 p.m., a woman named Gail Garland was leaving work, headed home for her lunch break. Gail Garland was the homeowner of the Woodinville property, who had had her home on the market for a short period of time. She had been expecting a potential buyer to view the home late that morning, but they were expected to be gone by the time she arrived home for lunch. It was around 12:40 p.m. when Gail made it to her home. She parked and entered the home through the garage. As she entered her house, she was immediately alarmed when she found the front door ajar. As she began walking towards the front door, likely anxious and a little annoyed, she could hear the sound of running water upstairs. When she had pulled up to her home, she had not seen any other cars parked in the driveway or along the street, so this was very odd, to say the least. She began creeping upstairs, unaware of what she was walking up to. As soon as she made it most of the way up the stairs, she could see a trail of blood leading into the bathroom, where the sound of running water was currently emanating. She slowly crept up to the bathroom, and as she opened the door, she was greeted by a horrifying image. The bruised and bloody body of Mike Emmert was filling up the bathtub of her upstairs bathroom. The sound of running water had come from the shower head, which had been turned on and left, as well as the running taps of the nearby double sink. Mary Beth Emmert, Mike's wife, was driving when she got a call from her mother. Her mother, another real estate agent that worked in the same Windermere office, had gotten word that something had happened to her son-in-law. Now, she had to be the one to break the bad news to her daughter, Mike's wife, by telephone. As Mary Beth described, she was originally unable to grasp what she was being told. Quote, "The realization that he was gone started to sink in while I was still on the telephone with my mom, but still hoping that, maybe he was alive and maybe they were wrong, Maybe it wasn't Mike, and I think it was just shock and disbelief." The crime scene would quickly become a hotbed of police activity, as both local police and sheriffs responded. This would become the first homicide in the city of Woodinville since 1997, so the King County Sheriff's Office was called in to assist from the get-go. Investigators were able to put together the series of events that had led to the arrival of homeowner Gail Garland, and it was not pretty. The working theory is that Mike had been showing the home to a client, this mysterious Stephen, and the two had been in an upstairs bedroom when the client hit him from behind. This blow had likely either knocked him down or even knocked him out. But from there, the attacker had proceeded to brutally beat and stab Mike. Mike was stabbed repeatedly. Later reports would indicate that he had been stabbed in total 19 times, with a weapon that resembled a long knife. From there, the attacker, likely this client, Stephen, had dragged the body of Mike Emmert roughly 18 feet from this bedroom to the bathtub that he was later found in, lying face down. After lifting him up and placing him inside of the tub, which required some physical prowess, this attacker had turned on the shower head and the sink. They had done both, likely, to eliminate any evidence from the body of Mike Emmert, and to clean off their hands and let the continued stream of water wash away their own forensic fingerprint. A later examination of Mike's body and the house could only find DNA belonging to him, so it seemed like this killer's theory had worked. He or she had left behind no trace of themselves at the crime scene. Police discovered that a number of items were missing from Mike's body, including his wallet, his cell phone, his wedding ring, and his watch. His wedding ring, a golden band with 3 diamonds aligned in a row, was worth a pretty penny. Estimates at the time put its value in the thousands. Likewise, Mike's watch, which was also missing, was a gold and silver Breitling wristwatch, worth upwards of $3,000. Despite these missing pieces of value, investigators never really considered the case a robbery. In fact, as they began to learn more about the case, they began to consider motives ranging from jealousy to this being a professional killing. Hours later, police recovered Mike Emmert's black Cadillac Escalade. It had been abandoned at the Kirkland Park Place shopping center that Mike had met the suspicious client twice in 2 days. They immediately suspected that Mike's killer had driven it back to the parking lot. A thorough examination of the vehicle discovered some unique blood and skin samples, which did not match up with Mike or any of his known acquaintances. The samples were submitted to the FBI DNA database later that year, in 2001. Within 24 hours of the murder, Mike's wallet would be found in Seattle itself. It was unknown why it was abandoned where it was, on top of a payphone at the Coleman Docks, also known as Pier 52, which is a ferry terminal. After looking through the wallet, investigators determined that Mike's ATM card was missing. A later check with bank records would discover that this ATM card had been used after Mike's murder. A few days later, Mike's cell phone was recovered. This detail was held a bit closer to the chest of investigators, who declined to say where or how it had been found. However, they would confirm that Mike's cell phone had been used after his murder, and had made some outgoing telephone calls. No details of those calls have ever been released, though. Unlike the other missing items, Mike's diamond wedding ring and his expensive wristwatch were never found. Within a week or two of the crime taking place, investigators developed their first suspect. This suspect was a homeless man who often hung around the area of the Kirkland Park Place shopping mall where Mike had twice encountered the mysterious Stephen. Not only did this transient match the physical description of this potential client, but he also had a physical limp and walked with a cane. In addition to being a Vietnam veteran, he had also worked as a counselor in the past, which matched multiple points in Mike's description of this enigmatic client. The man, Jeffrey John Solo, was in his early 60s, and he was a divorced father of 4. One of his children actually happens to be world-famous Olympic gold medalist Hope Solo. Jeffrey would later admit to both police and local newspapers that while he was a quote-unquote con man of sorts, he was not a killer. This was validated by his own criminal record, which showed a conviction in the late 1970s for fraud, but showed no signs of a violent history. Quote, "I've been in the street for 5 years. I've been mean, but I did not kill this guy. I didn't even know who he was." Detective Tom Jensen stated about this person of interest, quote, "This guy is a very good con artist." Jeffrey John Solo admitted that he had used women in the past, oftentimes posing as a potential homebuyer to meet female realtors and real estate agents. However, Solo said that whoever this killer was, it was not him. In fact, the killer might have been trying to frame him by posing as someone with so many similar characteristics. Jeffrey Solo cooperated with investigators, going through the process of taking a polygraph and giving up samples of both his hair and blood. Solo was never officially detained or charged with any crimes, and in March of 2001, he was officially cleared as a suspect. However, he still remained a person of interest. Sergeant John Urquhart, a spokesman for the King County Sheriff's Office, stated, quote, "We don't believe that he was part and parcel to the homicide. We're still trying to figure out what, if any, connections to the crime he may have." No further information would come to light, and eventually, Jeffrey John Solo was later cleared of any involvement. His daughter, Hope Solo, actually struggled to clear her father's name, even beyond his death in 2007 due to a heart attack. Hope Solo later told the publication, quote, "No matter what he did, he was my father. He helped create the person I am. He showered me with love. He just did not know how to be a husband, or a father, or a responsible member of society." The investigation into the murder of Mike Emmert continued, and focused in on a number of potential motives. Investigators had started out by inquiring about Mike's finances, and worked their way into his group of family and friends. They wanted to determine if anyone in his social circle had a reason to want Mike killed, and if so, who stood to benefit from him being gone. John Holland, a detective for the King County Sheriff's Office, stated, quote, "While conducting hundreds of interviews with people, even going back 10 years ago, and a prior business that he was involved in, we have not interviewed anybody that can establish why someone would want to have Mike Emmert killed." This included an exhaustive investigation into Mike's own wife, Mary Beth, and his assortment of colleagues. Nothing was found. By this point, police had worked around to the theory that whoever had killed Mike Emmert had likely conducted similar violent crimes. John Holland, the detective I just quoted, said as much. Quote, "Whoever did it is at least experienced." This began to lead police down the path of believing that this crime had been premeditated, at the very least. And, to the furthest that their investigation could extend, it even looked like this could be the work of a professional hitman. Investigators were able to discover that whoever had met up with Mike Emmert that day, likely this client he referred to as Steven in his daily planner, had used payphones to make contact with Mike. They had not met with or spoken with any of Mike's coworkers, making it a point to contact him directly from anonymous payphones. It is not publicly known how many houses that this mysterious client had been looking at, but police theorized that this house was purposefully chosen by this unknown killer. Likely because it was so isolated and separated from any of the neighbors. Jim Doyen, a detective for the King County Sheriff's Office, may be a familiar name for some of you. He was one of the detectives who worked on the decades-long Green River Killer case, and he even popped up in a prior story that I've covered, that of missing teenager Misty Copsey. Detective Doyen was active in this investigation, and spoke about the killer's methodology. Quote, "It appears that he may have reconnoitered and actually singled out this home as the best place to assault Mike. Now that suggests some sophisticated criminal thinking going on." Out of the very few details that police were able to glean about this mysterious client, taken from conversations Mike had had with his wife and other co-workers, a prominent tidbit was that the killer had walked with a limp and used a cane for assistance. They now believed that this was a complete fabrication, meant to lull Mike Emmert into a false sense of security. From the evidence that they were able to put together, it had seemed like the killer attacked Mike from behind, in one of the bedrooms. He had shown the ability to physically overpower Mike, who stood about 6 feet tall, weighed approximately 185 pounds, and was in very good shape. Mike had been beaten and stabbed numerous times, and from there, the killer was able to drag or carry Mike over 18 feet, from this bedroom to the bathroom that he was later found in. Then, after dragging him to the bathroom, they were able to lift Mike up into the bathtub, where he was later found, all without leaving behind any evidence of his own. If this was the action of a man in his early 50s, as Mike had described, he was definitely not physically impaired. Now, police turned their sights on the possible weapon used by Mike's attacker. Due to the stab wounds and the examination performed by the autopsy, it had seemed like the killer had utilized a very long knife. However, months later, it would be revealed that this could have been a long knife or even a sword. It was then theorized that the cane utilized by this mysterious Stephen might have contained a hidden blade, which was concealed up until its usage. Detective Jim Doyen stated, quote, "I think it's possible that the weapon was this cane, and the cane might have been one of these sword canes or a cane with a knife in it. So maybe the initial blitz assault to stun Mike was striking Mike with the cane from behind. The knife portion of the cane was used to kill Mike. Mike was nearly 6 feet tall, weighed 187 pounds. I think we have an offender here that was able to overcome a man of Mike's stature and then drag his body perhaps about 18 feet, from one room to where he came to rest. The water in the shower was turned on, and the 2 faucets in the vanity sinks were found running. That, to me, speaks of an attempt to get rid of any trace evidence. Hairs, fibers, things like that would be washed down the drain. He's cleaning his hands off in the sink, cleaning the weapon off in the sink. This was probably not this individual's first murder, or certainly not his first violent assault." Over 10 King County investigators worked on the case early on, contributing their expertise and legwork. However, all of these detectives, aided by a countless number of fellow officers, aides, analysts, and experts, were unable to come up with any smoking gun that pointed to a suspect, outside of a small amount of DNA found in Mike's SUV, which had not found any matches. It seemed like the culprit had covered up their tracks insanely well. John Urquhart, of the King County Sheriff's Office, stated, quote, "What's most unusual about this case is we still don't have a motive. Usually in these cases, there's something to do with sex, drugs, or money. It's just not there. Out of the people affected by Mike's tragic death, none was hit harder than his wife, Mary Beth. Just hours before his senseless murder, she had been looking forward to a long and happy life with Mike as her soulmate. But then, on a random Thursday, in January of 2001, that had changed forever. Quote, "It is important we have that final closure, that we know whoever did this is brought to justice. It doesn't really matter what punishment they receive. Just knowing who did this and what their reasons for doing it were will be important for my daughter. She's only 12. Mary Beth struggled endlessly after Mike's murder, mainly with his violent, sudden end. Quote, "I've been putting his murder and his death in 2 separate places, because if I dwelt on the fact he was murdered, I'm pretty sure I'd never get out of bed." As weeks began to turn into months, she continued to struggle with the very notion of Mike being murdered. Quote, "It's just like being blown up from the inside out. I do feel not having that closure is definitely standing in the way of me saying my final goodbye to Mike." Brad Blackburn, a lifelong friend of Mike's that lived in his hometown of Walla Walla, received the news in shock. Quote, "He was a great guy. It's very unfortunate. He didn't deserve this." A $50,000 reward was announced, primarily put together by local real estate organizations that were concerned about the very nature of this case. Mike's boss, Joe Deasy, who owned several Windermere establishments on the east side, said that Mike's death, quote, "made us realize we needed to take our safety precautions to an entirely different level." This fear was felt by realtors through the Pacific Northwest, and Mike Emmert's murder served as a major impetus for safety standards in real estate. The Washington State Real Estate Safety Council was established shortly thereafter, and aimed to protect real estate agents and keep them from unsafe situations. It created standards which still stand today, in particular client vetting, in which real estate agents or realtors will often require clients leave a copy or their driver's license at an office whenever they head to a property together. Also, they no longer meet up with clients at a third location, insisting they meet up beforehand at their office. Mike's case was highlighted in an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, hosted by Robert Stack. The episode aired on September 12th, 2001, while most viewers were distracted by the events of the day before. Many think that the story did not have much resonance in the media for that reason, as the events of 9/11 caused even fans of the original series to miss that episode's airing. After the second anniversary of Mike's tragic death, Mary Beth spoke with local publications. She was still struggling to get back to some kind of normality, even 2 years out, but stated, quote, "At least I feel the fog has lifted some. Slowly but surely, I'm digging myself out." John Holland, a detective for the King County Sheriff's Office, spoke to the press in 2004, over 3 years removed from the crime itself. He stated that the police were still unsure of how to follow up on any leads, since they did not have an understanding of the killer himself. Quote, "This person that he met with, we have no idea who that is. We don't even know if that's the real name of the person, and we don't know how accurate that description is." Detective Holland's words were less than positive, and seemed to indicate that the investigation was close to entering cold case status, especially when he shared, quote, "We don't really have a direction to go." Despite all of that, Mary Beth Emmert, Mike's widowed wife, remained optimistic and hopeful regarding the hunt for her husband's killer. Quote, "I'm trying to be patient, and I just know someday they'll call and have good news for me. I know when they catch someone, I'll be reliving the whole thing. But I'm so ready to go and fight for justice for Mike." Over the next decade, Mike Emmert's case continued to languish. Investigators were unable to uncover any new information about the mysterious client that Mike had met with on the morning of his murder, and whether or not this person was his killer. They struggled to come up with any new evidence, other than the trace amount of DNA found in Mike's Cadillac Escalade, which belonged to an unknown third party. It had been submitted to the FBI forensic database later that year, in 2001, but had come up with nothing in the years since. A decade passed. In that time, Mike's story became a cautionary tale for real estate agents and realtors, and helped lead to overhauls in their safety precautions. But his case remained unsolved, and flew mostly under the radar for the area at large. Then, in September of 2011, Mike's widow, Mary Beth, received a call. In that call, she was finally given the good news that she had been waiting for since January of 2001. According to the law enforcement official on the other end of the phone, they had a, quote, "rock-solid DNA match." Gary Kruger was born on January 28, 1948. He graduated from Seattle's Lincoln High School in 1967, enlisting in the United States Navy before he could even graduate. He left for Vietnam in November of 1967, and shortly after arriving, volunteered for the U.S. Marine Corps. While in the Marines, he became part of the Combined Action Group, an elite, experimental group that merged community service with PSYOPs work in Vietnam. Gary was present for the Tet Offensive, as well as many other pivotal moments of the war itself. While in Vietnam, Gary's mindset began to change. He became much more aggressive, his patience depleted, and when he returned to the States just 2 years after his enlistment, he came back as a very changed young man. Kruger was honorably discharged in January of 1969, and returned to the Seattle area that he had grown up in. In June of 1969, Gary Kruger became a Seattle police officer, as well as joining the Army Reserves. Over the next 11 years, he would work various beats for the Seattle PD, including patrol, traffic, and even tactical squad duty. In the early 1970s, he met and married his wife, Betty, and the two would have a tumultuous relationship over the next few decades. They also produced one child, a daughter, shortly after their marriage. While a police officer, Gary obtained a bit of a poor reputation, and his quick temper would get him into a handful of pickles as a cop. In 1970, Gary responded to a call from a hospital, in which a patient, an unruly Vietnam vet, much like himself, was harassing nurses and other patients. Gary used a wrestling hold to restrain this fellow veteran, and as a result, the man later died. Gary faced no punishment for this incident. In 1974, Gary was responsible for beating a man alongside another police officer. The man, who had been arrested by the two officers, was beaten severely inside a police parking garage. Gary and the other officer received a slap on the wrist, and the man that was beaten was later awarded $3,000 in a civil case. In 1977, Gary was in pursuit of a prowling suspect. While sitting in the front seat of his patrol car, he claimed that the suspect produced a knife and threatened his life. Without even needing to stand up, Gary Kruger shot the suspect, named Roger Lee Stanley, 4 times. Stanley died at the scene. Gary was actually tried in court for this shooting incident, but it was ruled as justified by a jury. In 1979, Gary entered a blind rage when a man, who was high on PCP, tried shooting Gary with his own weapon. In response, Gary began to beat the man severely. It was described in multiple reports that this man was nearly beaten to death. Gary was only stopped by other officers, who pulled him off of the drugged-out suspect. This last violent incident had him referred to a psychologist, and a troubled friend even took away Gary's weapons as a precaution. At this point, Gary's anger issues had turned into a serious problem. It had divided him from his own family, and seemed poised to ruin his relationship with his coworkers and his friends. He began to attend court-ordered therapy sessions, and in 1980, psychiatrist John Berberich called Gary a quote-unquote liability in a professional letter. Quote, Officer Kruger was becoming increasingly unable to control his temper and was becoming physically abusive to suspects and exercising excessive force. It was in 1980 that Gary Kruger officially announced his retirement from the Seattle Police Department. In his letter of retirement, he cited a back injury obtained during a foot pursuit, but almost everyone knew the actual reason. It was either retire or be fired. He also had to withdraw from the Army Reserves during this time period. Gary Kruger was just entering his early 30s, but he had already found himself removed from the 2 careers that he had pursued. Now he found himself lost, adrift, and angrier than ever. After being pushed out of the Seattle Police Department, Gary Kruger began a short-lived career as a real estate agent. However, this was really short-lived. By 1982, Gary was again unemployed, and now facing bankruptcy. Kruger had developed a series of personal issues throughout the 1970s. Most notable was his temper, but hidden under the surface was a gambling habit, which had turned into an addiction. Both of these had led to him separating from his wife, Betty, in the mid-1970s. They eventually reconciled, but then officially divorced in 1979. From there, Gary's habits got worse and worse. He doubled down on his gambling addictions after his real estate career dried up, and he began to lose himself in a spiral of uncontrollable emotions. But in 1984, things began to look up once again. Gary found himself with some pocket money, and he was even able to reconcile with his wife, Betty. They remarried that year, and Gary, who was still out of work, was able to pay for their small family to take vacations through the US. Things seemed to be trending upwards over the next couple of years, at least until October of 1986. A Grays Harbor County deputy began following a speeding Chrysler driven by a suspicious-looking individual. As the deputy followed the vehicle, he called in the license plate and discovered that the vehicle had been stolen just outside of Seattle. Eventually, the vehicle pursuit ended in a dramatic crash and the Chrysler went off the road. When the deputy stepped forward to check the driver, he found Gary Kruger behind the wheel, wearing a trench coat and having in his possession 2 duffel bags that contained ski masks, rubber masks, a police scanner, and multiple firearms. A check on these items pointed to a bank robbery spree, which had spanned between 1984 and 1986, which had hit the towns of Aberdeen, Grayland, Freeland, Nacelle, Rochester, and Graham. In all of these incidents, one of the bandits had demanded quote-unquote big money and traveler's checks. Coincidentally, Gary used traveler's checks frequently. In March of 1987, Gary Kruger pleaded guilty to 2 federal felony armed robbery charges. His robbery partner, Carl Keller, cooperated with investigators before he did, and was able to plead guilty to only one of the charges. Gary Kruger was given a 15-year sentence for the bank robbery spree, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. Behind bars, Kruger must have been a model prisoner, because he was released a little over 5 years after pleading guilty, in 1992. His family had stood by him during his incarceration, suffering through intense financial hardship with him behind bars. Gary was still relatively young, just in his mid-40s, and he still had time to get his life back on track. However, Gary had already fallen too far into a criminal mindset, and had lost himself there. In January of 1999, Gary Kruger was given a misdemeanor charge for third-degree theft in Kirkland, Washington. With it being a misdemeanor, it did not carry any jail time. Just a month after the murder of real estate agent Mike Emmert, a bank was robbed in Issaquah, Washington. The bandit made away with $3,130. We know that this crime was committed by Gary Kruger because just 2 months later, the robber struck the same bank again. Using a pellet gun to hold up the tellers, the bandit managed to escape out the front doors with just over $6,500. However, while attempting to flee, the thief was arrested. Surprise, surprise, it was Gary Kruger. During his trial proceedings, he was convicted on the 2 robbery charges and given a rather lenient sentence of 70 months. The judge took pity on Kruger's recent diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder and urged him to get his life together. Throughout this entire time, Gary's wife, Betty, had stuck by him. Her patience was rewarded again in 2004 when Gary was given a chance to be released early. Gary Kruger said yes to an agreement which would allow him to be paroled early, in exchange for him submitting his DNA to federal authorities. Unfortunately, Gary would be released in 2004, but a DNA sample would not be collected by federal parole officers until 2007. Even then, after obtaining this sample, it was sent to the FBI offices in Virginia, where it sat for several more years, caught up in their perpetual backlog of forensic testing. When Gary Kruger's DNA sample was finally tested, in 2011, it had been nearly a decade since he had been originally paroled, and, as investigators would soon learn, this testing would be much too little and conducted much too late. In March of 2010, the McAllister family was terrorized by a couple of would-be home invaders along Lake Washington. This is the story I told you in the introduction of this episode, how an orthopedic surgeon fought back against 2 masked men, got pistol whipped, and the 2 gunmen ended up running off into the night. Well, left behind at the scene was a ski mask, which had belonged to one of the gunmen. Dr. Craig McAllister had ripped it off during their scuffle, and it had been abandoned by the 2 men as they made their quick getaway. Well, a forensic examination of the ski mask yielded multiple DNA samples. When they were put into the system, they quickly came up with a suspect, a man named John Allen Bradshaw. John Allen Bradshaw was, at this point, 65 years old. His past did not point to any kind of violent crime, at least not crimes related to home invasion. Rather, he had been previously convicted for arson and money laundering, which yielded an 8-year sentence. He had been convicted in 2001 and was released in 2008. However, a quick check through his records pointed to an address where he had been living. The house he had been living in was owned by none other than one Gary Kruger. Police attempted to find John Allen Bradshaw, but even weeks after the failed home invasion of the McAllister home, they could not find him. Neither could they find his landlord, Gary Kruger. In fact, just 1 week after the failed home invasion, Gary's wife, Betty, had filed a missing persons report. In it, she stated that her husband, Gary, was broke and was very desperate for money. Police now suspected that the two men were in on the attempted crime together, perhaps intending to rob the McAllisters. But the motive was truly unknown. After all, if robbery was the motive, they likely would have gone after a much more cash-heavy target. Police would spend the next 6 months trying to fit the pieces together, but it wasn't until September that they would make another huge discovery. In September of 2010, the body of Gary Kruger was found, floating along the surface of Lake Washington. His wife, Betty Kruger, filed for bankruptcy the very next day. A thorough examination of his surroundings revealed a capsized boat nearby where his body was found. The 9-foot skiff had been stolen from a neighbor of the McAllisters on the night that the attempted home invasion occurred. Now, 6 months later, it was found buried underneath the surface of Lake Washington, nearby one of the people that police suspected was involved with the home invasion. Inside the boat, investigators found a duffel bag that contained hand restraints, duct tape, and ammunition for the weapons that the two men, Gary Kruger and John Allen Bradshaw, had been supposedly carrying. This discovery led to many questions about the motives of these two men, and whether it had been a simple robbery. These tools seemed to indicate a much more violent potential outcome. Investigators could only find obscure links between the McAllister family and either Kruger or Bradshaw, but they continued to operate as if the missing suspect, Bradshaw, was still alive. Dr. Craig McAllister, the homeowner who had attempted to fight off the two armed men, stated, quote, "We're functioning as if Bradshaw is alive and he's coming back. It's just safer to function that way than to let our guard down." This view was shared by the King County Sheriff's Office, even though they had a much more realistic outlook. They had discovered the van that Kruger and Bradshaw had been driving on the night in question, and it was found at a strip mall parking lot just a little over a mile away from the McAllister home. This indicated to police that the two men had meant to go back, but never got the chance. Sergeant John Urquhart, the King County Sheriff's spokesman, stated about the possibility of John Allen Bradshaw still being alive. Quote, "Of course it's possible, but they went in the water in March in the middle of the night. You'd have to be a pretty good swimmer." Years later, in 2016, King County finally released a statement determining that the motive for this failed home invasion was something so mundane that it defied all expectations. Scott Tompkins, a detective for King County, stated, quote, "The motive was that the doctor would not do Betty's knee replacement surgery." Yes, you heard that right. Dr. Craig McAllister would not do a knee surgery for Gary Kruger's wife, for free. So instead of trying to figure out a payment plan, he decided to break into the McAllister home and ruin a family forever. For that, though, he ended up paying the ultimate price. But before he plunged into the depths of Lake Washington, unable to swim to safety, Gary Kruger had kept several secrets, which dated back decades. A year after the body of Gary Kruger was discovered floating in Lake Washington, the wife of murdered real estate agent Mike Emmert received a call. This phone call, informing her that a DNA match had been made to her husband's supposed killer, came with a caveat. The DNA match, which had paired up with forensic evidence found inside of Mike's black Cadillac Escalade, had been in the FBI's forensic database since 2001. However, the sample it paired up with, that of former police officer turned bank robber Gary Kruger, had been sitting on a shelf for over 4 years. As I've already discussed, Gary Kruger's DNA was supposed to be drawn when he was paroled back in 2004. A sample wasn't taken until 2007, and even when it was, it sat in the FBI's backlog for another 4 years. So by the time that Mary Beth received a phone call informing her that Mike's killer had been found, This alleged killer had already been dead for a year and a half. If the sample had been tested when it was submitted to the FBI back in 2007, investigators might have had a chance to detain Gary Kruger and question him thoroughly. They might have even been able to determine a potential motive, because now, even though Gary Kruger's DNA was found in Mike's Cadillac Escalade, they were no closer to determining why. They began looking into Gary Kruger's real estate dealings. After all, while his post-law enforcement real estate career was short-lived, he also owned a couple of properties in the area. And since his partner in crime, John Allen Bradshaw, had been previously convicted for arson and money laundering, they thought there might be some kind of connection there. However, after another exhaustive amount of digging, investigators could find nothing that linked Kruger to Mike Emmert. But they did find some connections that dated back through the 1980s. And all of it tied back into investigators' most prominent theory, that the murder of Mike Emmert had been a professional hit. In 1981, a former police officer named Terry Dolan was shot outside of a gas station. He actually owned and managed the gas station in Everett, Washington. He was killed in what originally looked like a robbery, but was later determined to be staged by the unknown killer. Gary Kruger, then a struggling real estate agent, was suspected of involvement in the crime, but never charged due to a lack of evidence. In 1984, a Bellevue attorney named Jim Berry stayed late at work, preparing for a late-night appointment with a client. He was then stabbed repeatedly by an unknown attacker, and left to bleed out in his office. Gary Kruger was not initially suspected, but it was later determined that Berry, an attorney, was representing a bank that was involved in collection efforts against Kruger, who had fallen behind and was now delinquent on a very large loan. In 1985, a Seattle union boss, who headed the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union Local 8, was found murdered in a bathtub, in a crime that bore a striking resemblance to the murder of Mike Emmert. Mario Vaccarino had been beaten to death before being dragged into a bathtub. Parmesan cheese had been sprinkled over his body, which was alleged to be some kind of mob warning. It was assumed that this crime was linked to the mob's potential takeover of union pension plans. Kruger was actually suspected of involvement in this crime as well, after it was revealed that his buddy, Joe Massimino Sr., worked for the same union. Massimino worked under the victim and was actually worried about being fired. After Vaccarino's death, though, he succeeded the man and became union president. After Gary Kruger's death, investigators questioned his wife, Betty, about his potential criminal involvement. When the subject of Mario Vaccarino came up, she all but admitted to Gary's involvement in the murder. As King County Detective Scott Tompkins later said, quote, "We told her, look, we can't do anything to Gary. He's dead. We're just trying to get answers to the victims. We asked her, did he kill Mario? Betty Kruger responded, quote, of course he did. It is believed that Gary Kruger had a hand in all three of these murders from the early 1980s. Kruger popped up as a person of interest in all three crimes, but police never had enough evidence against him to officially file charges. While Gary had some kind of connection to all three victims, it is believed that he might have murdered all three as a professional, that is, as a quote-unquote hitman. The crimes might have been conducted as a favor to friends or out of his own self-interest. But after information began to arise, tying Kruger to these three separate crimes, police publicly floated their belief that Gary Kruger was a professional hitman. Chris Halsney, an investigative journalist who covered Gary Kruger's past for the Seattle area TV station Cairo, stated about the former police officer, quote, write up a terrible, evil character, a serial killer, a man with no soul, and think it's fiction. But you're really writing about Gary Kruger. In addition to the three unsolved murders from the 1980s, King County Sheriff's investigators publicly stated in 2011 that they believe Gary Kruger was the man responsible for killing Mike Emmert back in 2001. Based on his violent history, and his DNA being found in Mike's SUV for no apparent reason, he has emerged as their primary suspect. However, it is still unknown why he would have been involved. The only potential motive that investigators could determine was that Gary Kruger had been a professional hitman, Perhaps not a very active one, but a paid killer nonetheless. Questions were raised about why it had taken so long for the DNA to match up. After all, Kruger had been a convicted felon before Mike's murder, and was supposed to submit his own DNA upon his parole back in 2004. As I've already stated, that did not happen, until it was taken in 2007 and later tested in 2011. This delay in testing has become a hot-button issue in the criminal justice community, as forensic testing becomes a much more vital component of the system at large. Analysts are presented with more and more samples to test and compare against the millions of additional samples in the FBI forensic databases. This backlog has led to many cases like this, where answers are found, but they're found much too late for any true justice to be served. Compounding this issue of a forensic testing backlog, areas like King County have found themselves facing budget issues over the last decade or so. The King County Cold Case Unit was actually disbanded at the end of 2012, due to the dissolution of a large grant and an overall lack of funding. The Cold Case Unit, which had solved 8 murder cases between 2009 and 2012, was forced to close up shop and hand off all of its case files to King County's Major Crimes Division, who now try to work on cold cases in between their more pressing investigative work. This happens to include CSI work, which is handled in-house. After all, King County does not have a dedicated CSI unit of its own, and works in cooperation with AFIS and other King County Sheriff's units. Scott Tompkins, a King County detective that I have quoted throughout this episode, discussed the impact of cold cases being handled by major crimes investigators. Quote, "Although you have the best intentions to get to it, the day-to-day stuff piles up and you don't get to it." At the time of the closure, King County had over 230 unsolved cases, which were then handed off to the, quote, 2 sergeants, 12 detectives, 1 polygraphist, and administrative support that work for the MCU. And that's a quote taken directly from the King County Sheriff's website. Sergeant Jesse Anderson, who worked as the head of the cold case unit, stated, quote, "We've tried in the past to work these cases on an as time permits basis, but it just doesn't work. We don't want to leave them, the families of victims, without any hope. But to actively work these investigations, we will not have the people to do it." It has now been close to 7 years since police uncovered a link between the unsolved murder of Micheal Emmert and former police officer Gary Kruger, but they are still no closer to determining how the two had come into contact, and why. What we know about Mike Emmert is that he was a successful real estate agent who had a promising career ahead of him, was well liked and well regarded among everyone that knew him, and who seemed like an all-around great guy. Meanwhile, Gary Kruger was a disgraced former police officer turned career criminal who had been in and out of prison for 20 years at the time of Mike Emmert's death. He had been a failed real estate agent in the early 1980s, when Micheal was still in college, and who had developed a bad gambling habit over his unfortunate life. Was this murder a well-constructed robbery gone wrong, or was there something more to it? King County investigators have proposed a probable yet troubling theory of their own, that Gary Kruger was a contract killer, who is suspected of involvement in a number of violent deaths following his career in law enforcement. These are all puzzle pieces that create an image which is still unfinished. After all, if Gary Kruger was a professional hitman, as investigators claim, that means that the person who hired him is still out there. And while Gary Kruger drowned in Lake Washington following a botched home invasion in 2010, the person that may have paid him to kill Mike Emmert has escaped justice for nearly 20 years. Any answers that Kruger could have provided drowned with him. While many publications seem to indicate that the case has been solved, that is not the case. Investigators have put together an incredibly enticing story regarding their chief suspect, Gary Kruger, but it is just that, a story. Kruger never stood in front of a courtroom, so it is impossible to convict him post-mortem. As such, the case of Mike Emmert is still wide open, and you don't have to take my word for it. In 2016, 5 years after this discovery was made public, King County Sheriff spokesman Sergeant John Urquhart said as much. Quote, "The case of Mike Emmert is an open and active case. If you or anyone you know may have information about the case, please reach out to investigators." 2 items of Micheal Emmert's have never been recovered: his gold and silver Breitling Chronomat watch and a gold wedding ring, which had 3 diamonds in a row across the center. The interior of the ring is inscribed with the letters ADI. If these sound familiar, or any other details ring a bell, please don't be afraid to reach out. The King County Sheriff's Office can be reached at 206-296-3311, and they have a web presence as well. Sergeant John Urquhart, among others that work for King County, believe that a single tip could still be the thing that breaks this case. As of this episode's recording, the story of Mike Emmert remains unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. If you would like to keep in touch with me or the podcast, make sure to check out the social media pages for Unresolved, such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All can be found on their respective apps or websites by searching for @UnresolvedPod. If you would like to send in an email, you could do so by shooting over your thoughts and opinions to theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com, without any spaces or dashes or anything like that. You could also send them in to me personally at michael@unresolved.me. And as always, that's MICHEAL. Voicemails and text can be sent in to 831-200-3550 as well. Once again, that's 831-200-3550. And as always, any of this information can be found on the podcast website, as well as a written transcript of each episode, along with any necessary information or links. That website can be found at unresolved.me. Once again, that's unresolved.me. Until next time, everyone, stay safe, and I will talk to you later.